My brother sold our father's house 3 weeks after the funeral. He forged my signature to do it, and when he walked into that title company expecting to collect a check for $375,000, he found out the hard way that you don't commit forgery against someone who catches forgers for the United States Secret Service. My name is Claire Hargrove. I'm 35 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed that grief was the worst thing my family could put me through. I was wrong. Grief was just the door my brother walked through to rob me blind. Let me start from the beginning. My father, Thomas Hargrove, died on a Tuesday in October. Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed in March. Gone by fall. 6 months of watching the strongest man I'd ever known shrink into someone I barely recognized. Hooked to machines in a hospital bed, we'd set up in the living room of the house he'd built with his own hands in 1987. That house meant everything. A 4-bedroom colonial on Birch Lane in Ridgewood, New Jersey. Not a mansion, not a showpiece, just a home. Dad had laid every tile in the kitchen himself. He'd built the back deck the summer I turned 8, letting me hold nails while he hammered, telling me I was his best assistant. The oak tree in the front yard had a tire swing he'd hung for us when we were kids. My mother's rose garden, still blooming every spring, even though she'd been gone for 12 years, lined the stone walkway to the front door. That house was worth $750,000. Dad left it to my brother, Garrett, and me, split equally. In a will that could not have been clearer, the house on Birch Lane shall be divided equally between my children, Claire Elizabeth Hargrove and Garrett Thomas Hargrove. They shall mutually decide whether to keep or sell the property. Neither may act without the written consent of the other. Dad knew us. He knew Garrett. He put that last sentence in for a reason. Garrett is 39. He's the kind of man who walks into a room and immediately needs everyone in it to look at him. Tall, loud, confident in the way that people mistake for competence. He sells commercial real estate in Manhattan and talks about it like he's performing open-heart surgery. Every conversation with Garrett eventually circles back to Garrett. His deals, his clients, his car, his apartment in Murray Hill that he couldn't actually afford. Our mother, Judith, thought the sun rose and set on him. She always had. When Garrett made the varsity baseball team, she threw a party. When I graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown, she asked if I could pick up Garrett's dry cleaning on the way home. When Garrett got his real estate license, she told everyone at Thanksgiving. When I got hired by the United States Secret Service, she said, "Oh, that's nice, Claire," and then spent 20 minutes asking Garrett about a condo listing in Tribeca. She never understood what I did. She never asked. If someone brought it up, she'd wave her hand and say Claire works for the government. Some kind of desk job, which was technically true in the same way that saying a surgeon works at a hospital is technically true. Here's what I actually do. I'm a senior forensic document examiner in the Secret Service's Financial Crimes Division. I analyze questioned documents, forged checks, counterfeit bonds, falsified contracts, altered wills. I've testified as an expert witness in 43 federal cases. I can identify a forged signature under magnification faster than most people can sign their own name. I've put people in federal prison for doing exactly what my brother was about to do, but I didn't know that yet. Not on the night of the family dinner. 3 weeks after Dad's funeral, my mother organized what she called a gathering to honor his memory. A Sunday dinner at her townhouse in Montclair. She'd invited Garrett, me, my husband Ben, Aunt Lorraine, who was Dad's younger sister, a few cousins, and a handful of Dad's old friends from the neighborhood. About 20 people total. I almost didn't go. Ben and I had spent the previous week sorting through Dad's papers, meeting with his attorney, and beginning the long, exhausting process of estate administration. I was emotionally drained. But Ben said it would be good for me. Your dad's friends will be there. Lorraine will be there. It doesn't have to be about your mother. So we went. The dinner was fine at first. Aunt Lorraine told stories about Dad as a teenager. Mr. Patterson from next door talked about the time Dad helped him rebuild his garage after a storm. People laughed, people cried. It was exactly what a memorial dinner should be. And then Garrett stood up. He tapped his wine glass with a fork, and the room went quiet. He was wearing a suit. On a Sunday, at a casual family dinner. That should have been my first warning. I want to say something about Dad, Garrett began, and I remember thinking, okay, maybe he's going to be decent for once. Maybe grief had softened him. Maybe losing our father had reminded him that there are things in this world more important than Garrett Hargrove. Dad always said the house on Birch Lane was his greatest achievement. Not his career, not his investments, the house. Because it represented what he built for this family. People were nodding. Aunt Lorraine had tears in her eyes. That's why I know Dad would be proud of what I've done. My stomach dropped. Ben reached for my hand under the table. I've been working on something big, Garrett continued, his voice swelling with the same tone he used when he closed a deal. Something that honors Dad's legacy and secures our family's future. Last week, I finalized the sale of the Birch Lane property to a developer for $750,000. The room went silent, not a respectful, contemplative silence, a stunned, something is very wrong silence. Aunt Lorraine spoke first. You did what? Garrett smiled. He actually smiled. The market's at a peak. I got above asking price. The closing is scheduled for next Friday. The house is going to be torn down and replaced with 3 luxury townhomes. It's the smartest financial move for everyone. I couldn't breathe. My father's house, the kitchen tiles, the back deck, my mother's roses, the tire swing, torn down, sold, gone. I found my voice. Garrett, I didn't sign anything. You can't sell that house without my written consent. It's in the will. Garrett didn't even look at me. He looked at our mother, who was nodding along like she was watching her son accept an award. It's handled, Claire. The paperwork is done. Both signatures are on the quitclaim deed. I filed it with the county clerk last Wednesday. Both signatures. I had not signed a single document related to that house. Not one. I stared at my brother across the table, and the pieces began falling into place with a clarity that made my skin crawl. He had forged my signature. Garrett. I said his name slowly, carefully, the way you speak when you're trying very hard not to scream. I did not sign a quitclaim deed. I did not authorize the sale of that property. He finally looked at me. Mom signed for you. She has power of attorney. She does not. My mother's voice cut in from the end of the table. Claire, stop making a scene. Your father would have wanted this. Garrett knows the real estate market. You don't. Ben's hand tightened around mine. He leaned close to my ear. Don't react here. Not in front of Dad's friends. We handle this the right way. He was right. I knew he was right. But sitting there, listening to my brother casually announce that he'd stolen my inheritance at a dinner meant to honor my dead father, while my mother nodded along like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, was the hardest thing I've ever had to stay silent through. I lasted another 45 minutes. I hugged Aunt Lauren, who whispered in my ear, Your father would never have allowed this. I thanked Mr. Patterson for coming, and I left without saying a word to Garrett or my mother. In the car, Ben drove while I pulled out my phone. I opened the Bergen County Clerk's online records portal. It took me less than 3 minutes to find it. A quitclaim deed, filed 6 days earlier, transferring full ownership of 47 Birch Lane from Claire E. Hargrove and Garrett T. Hargrove to Garrett T. Hargrove alone. My signature was on the document, a signature I had never written. I zoomed in on the image, and I almost laughed. Almost. See, here's the thing about forging someone's signature. Most people think the key is making it look similar. Getting the loops right, the slant, the pressure. And Garrett had done a passable job to the untrained eye. A county clerk processing hundreds of documents a day probably wouldn't look twice. But I'm not a county clerk. I'm the person the FBI calls when they need a signature authenticated in a case going to federal trial. And within 30 seconds of looking at that image on my phone screen, I could identify at least 4 telltale markers of forgery. The pen pressure was too uniform, no natural variation. The baseline of the signature tilted 3 degrees left when mine consistently tilts right. The connecting stroke between my first and last name was continuous when I always lift the pen, and the letter G in Hargrove was closed at the bottom when mine is always open. My brother had Googled how to fake a signature and thought that was enough to fool the person who wrote the federal manual on signature verification. That night, after Ben and I put our daughter to sleep, I sat down at my desk and made 3 calls. The first was to my supervisor at the Secret Service, Deputy Director Angela Vasquez. I explained the situation factually, without emotion, the way I'd been trained to present evidence. Angela listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, Claire, I want you to formally document everything. Photograph that deed. Pull the county records. And I'm connecting you with the bureau tomorrow morning. This is textbook forgery and fraud. We'll make sure it's handled right." The second call was to Dad's attorney, Richard Keene. "Richard, are you aware that Garrett filed a quitclaim deed with a forged signature and is attempting to sell the Birch Lane property?" Richard was silent for 5 seconds. Then he said a word I won't repeat. "No," he said. "And Claire, your father specifically structured that will to prevent exactly this. I have the original, notarized, with witnesses. If your brother forged that deed, he's committed a felony, and I will personally ensure that sale never closes." The third call was to Aunt Lorraine. She didn't need convincing. She'd watched my mother favor Garrett for 35 years. She'd seen it happen to her own brother. She'd watched Dad's heart break every time Claire was passed over for her older brother. Aunt Lorraine didn't cry. She just said, "Tell me what you need me to do." The next morning, a Monday, I drove to the Bergen County Clerk's office and requested a certified copy of the quitclaim deed. I examined it that afternoon in my lab at the Secret Service field office in Newark, using the same equipment I used to analyze counterfeit treasury bonds and forged federal documents. I performed a complete forensic analysis of my own signature on that deed. The results were unambiguous. The signature was a simulation forgery, meaning someone had practiced copying my signature and then executed it freehand. Under 20 times magnification, I documented 14 distinct points of divergence from my authentic signature, which I had exemplars of from tax returns, my marriage certificate, and my federal employment records. Pen hesitations at stroke initiations, tremor patterns inconsistent with natural handwriting, ink deposition anomalies suggesting the writer paused to check a reference sample. 14 points. In court, 3 is usually enough for a conviction. I compiled my findings into a formal forensic report, the same kind I prepare for federal prosecutions, and submitted it to the FBI's Newark field office along with a criminal complaint. Special Agent Marcus Webb was assigned to the case. He was thorough, methodical, and not remotely impressed by the fact that the suspect was a Manhattan real estate broker. Within 48 hours, Agent Webb had obtained Garrett's handwriting exemplars through a subpoena, cross-referenced them with the forged signature, confirmed my analysis, and obtained a federal warrant. But here's the part that keeps me warm at night. Garrett's closing was scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. at Continental Title Associates in Hackensack. He was going to walk in, sign the final documents, and walk out with a cashier's check for $750,000, $375,000 of which was mine. Agent Webb asked me if I wanted to be present. I said yes. Friday at 1:45 p.m. I was sitting in a coffee shop across the street from Continental Title, watching the front entrance through the window. Ben was with me. He'd taken the day off work. He was holding my hand and not saying anything, because Ben always knows when I need silence more than words. At 1:52, Garrett pulled up in his leased BMW. He was wearing his best suit, the navy one he'd bought for closings because he said it made clients feel confident. He walked in carrying a leather portfolio and looking like a man who'd already spent the money in his head. At 1:55, my mother pulled up in her Lexus. She walked in after him, her purse over her arm, her hair freshly done. She was there to witness her golden child's triumph. At 2, the closing began. At 2:07, 2 FBI agents entered through the front door. At 2:08, 2 more entered through the side entrance. I know the exact times because Agent Webb was texting me updates in real time. I crossed the street. By the time I walked through the door of Continental Title, the conference room was frozen. The title company's closing agent, a woman named Patricia, was pressed against the far wall, with her hand over her mouth. The buyer's attorney was on his phone, presumably calling his client to explain that the deal was very much off. My mother was standing in the corner, her face the color of ash, and Garrett was sitting in a leather chair with his hands on the table, staring at Special Agent Webb's badge like it was a foreign object he'd never seen before. "Garrett Thomas Hargrove," Agent Webb said, in a voice that filled the room without being raised. "You're under arrest for forgery of a legal instrument, filing a fraudulent deed with a county office, attempted grand larceny, and wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent." Garrett's mouth opened and closed. He looked at our mother. He looked at the door. He looked at me. "Claire." His voice cracked. "Claire, What is this? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Agent Webb continued reading his rights while a second agent placed Garrett in handcuffs. My brother, who had spent 39 years believing he could take whatever he wanted from whoever he wanted, was being led out of a title company office in handcuffs on a Friday afternoon in Hackensack. Then Agent Webb turned to my mother. Judith Hargrove, we have evidence indicating your involvement in the creation and filing of the fraudulent deed. You're being detained for questioning. My mother's face went through 5 expressions in 3 seconds. Shock, confusion, anger, fear, and finally the one I'd waited 35 years to see. The realization that she could not talk her way out of this. Claire, she hissed at me as an agent took her arm. How could you do this to your own brother? To your own mother? Over a house. I looked at her. Over Dad's house. The house he built. The house he left to both of us. The house Garrett stole from me, with a forged signature. Yes, Mother. Over that house. She had nothing to say to that. For the first time in my life, my mother had nothing to say. The title company employees were staring. The buyer's attorney had stopped talking on his phone and was just watching. Patricia, the closing agent, later told a local reporter that it was the most dramatic thing she'd ever witnessed in 22 years of real estate closings. That quote made it into the Bergen County Record, the Star Ledger, and eventually, because the internet is what it is, several national outlets. Real estate broker arrested for forging sister's signature to steal inheritance, read the headline in the New York Post. Federal agents crash home sale closing after brother forges deed, reported NBC New York. The Star Ledger ran a piece that included a quote from the county clerk's office about how they were reviewing their verification procedures. Garrett and my mother spent 14 hours in federal custody. Garrett called me 7 times from jail before his attorney told him to stop. My mother called me once and left a voicemail that consisted entirely of crying and the sentence, "You've destroyed this family." I saved that voicemail. Not because I wanted to listen to it again, but because it was evidence of her complete inability to understand what she'd done. Derek, I'm sorry, Garrett's buyer, was refunded his earnest money and walked away from the deal. The sale was voided. Richard Keene, Dad's attorney, filed an emergency motion to restore the original deed, which was granted within a week. The house on Birch Lane was back in both our names, and this time, I immediately petitioned the court for a partition action to handle the property correctly, legally, and without my brother's involvement. The next 3 months were a cascade of consequences. Garrett's real estate license was suspended pending the outcome of his criminal case. His brokerage firm, upon learning that one of their agents had been arrested for forgery and fraud, terminated him immediately. His Manhattan apartment, which he'd been barely affording on commissions, became unaffordable overnight. He moved into our mother's townhouse in Montclair. I'm told they argue constantly. My mother's reputation in her social circle, which had been the most important thing in her world for as long as I could remember, evaporated. Her book club stopped inviting her. Her neighbor, Mrs. DeLuca, who she'd been friends with for 20 years, told her she didn't feel comfortable associating with someone facing federal charges. My mother, who had spent decades performing the role of the respectable suburban widow with the successful son, was now the woman from the news whose children were in a legal war over their dead father's house. Ben and I received a letter from her 2 months after the arrest. It was 4 pages long, handwritten, and contained 0 apologies. Instead, it was a detailed explanation of why everything was my fault. I'd always been difficult. I'd always been jealous of Garrett. I'd driven a wedge in the family by choosing a career that took me away from home. She'd only been trying to help Garrett because he needed the money more than I did. And the signature, well, she'd only signed my name because she knew I'd say yes eventually. So what was the difference? I showed it to Ben. He read it twice, put it down, and said, "She wrote 4 pages without once acknowledging that she committed a crime. That's genuinely impressive." I wrote back 1 line. "You forged my signature on a federal document. I reported a crime. If you can't tell the difference between family loyalty and felony fraud, we have nothing left to discuss." She hasn't contacted me since. I consider that the first real gift she's ever given me. Garrett accepted a plea deal 4 months after the arrest. 1 count of forgery, 1 count of fraud, 3 years probation, 300 hours of community service, full restitution of all legal costs, and a permanent felony on his record. His attorney argued for leniency based on family circumstances and grief over his father's death. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Reeves, was not moved. She noted in her ruling that Mr. Hargrove showed a calculated pattern of deception, not a momentary lapse in judgment, and that his lack of remorse was concerning. She added that the court found it particularly egregious that the defendant exploited his father's death as an opportunity for financial gain. My mother received a lighter deal: 2 years probation, 150 hours of community service, no jail time. The judge noted her role was secondary but emphasized that a mother's willingness to help one child steal from another represented a profound failure of parental responsibility. That quote made it into the sentencing coverage. 3 different news outlets ran it. Aunt Lorraine had it framed. Speaking of Aunt Lorraine, she called me the night the sentencing was reported. She was laughing and crying at the same time. "Your father was a quiet man," she said. "He never raised his voice, never made a scene, but he was the most stubborn person I ever knew. If something was wrong, he fixed it. He didn't complain. He didn't negotiate. He just handled it. Claire, you are your father's daughter in every way that matters. And if he's watching, which I believe he is, he's standing in that kitchen he built, leaning against that counter, and grinning from ear to ear." I cried for 20 minutes after that call. Ben held me and didn't say a word. The house on Birch Lane sold 3 months later through a court-ordered partition sale. I didn't want to keep it, not because the memories weren't precious, but because they already lived in me, in my daughter, in the photo albums and the Christmas ornaments and the recipe cards in Dad's handwriting that I'd taken from the kitchen drawer. The house was wood and brick and glass. The memories were mine, and no one could forge those. The final sale price was $810,000. After legal fees and the partition costs, I received my full share, $392,000. Every cent that was rightfully mine. I used part of it to start a college fund for my daughter, Sophia. The rest went into savings. Ben suggested we name the account after Dad. We did. The Thomas Hargrove Education Fund. Someday, when Sophia is old enough to understand, I'll tell her about her grandfather, about the house he built, the deck where he taught me to hold a hammer, the rose garden he kept blooming for 12 years after the woman who planted it was gone, and I'll tell her about what happened after he died, not because I want her to hate her uncle, but because I want her to understand that integrity isn't something you practice only when it's convenient. It's what you do when it costs you everything. Last Thanksgiving, Ben, Sophia, and I had dinner at Aunt Lorraine's house in Princeton. It was quiet, just us, Lorraine, and a few of Dad's old friends. No drama, no golden children, no stolen signatures. Just turkey, pumpkin pie, and people who loved each other without conditions. After dinner, Lorraine pulled me into her study. On her desk was a small framed photo I'd never seen before. My father, maybe 19 or 20, standing in front of a house with a hammer in his hand, grinning at the camera. On the back, in his handwriting, "First house I ever worked on, won't be the last." She also had something else framed next to it, the Star Ledger headline from the sentencing. "Real estate broker sentenced for forging sister's signature in inheritance scheme." She saw me looking at it and shrugged. "Your father always said the truth looks good on a wall. I'm just following his advice." I laughed until my sides hurt. Last week, I heard through a cousin that Garrett has been telling people the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that I overreacted, that the family is torn apart because Claire couldn't let go of a house. He's still living with our mother. He's still unemployed. He's still, after everything, completely unable to grasp that he committed a crime and got caught. My mother, I'm told, has rewritten the story entirely in her mind. In her version, she was trying to keep the family together, and I destroyed it by calling the authorities. She tells people that Claire always had a vindictive streak, which is a fascinating interpretation from a woman who helped her son forge a federal document. They'll never understand. And I've made peace with that. Some people see consequences as lessons. Others see them as persecution. My brother and my mother are the second kind. And no amount of evidence, legal rulings, or newspaper headlines will change that. But here's what I know. My father built a house with his hands. He left it to his children with clear instructions. One of those children tried to steal it. The other one protected it. And when my daughter asks me someday what I do for a living, I'll tell her the truth. I catch people who forge documents and steal what isn't theirs. And once, just once, I caught someone in my own family. My brother forged my signature to steal my inheritance. My mother helped him do it. They thought they'd get away with it because they'd always gotten away with everything. But this time, the person they stole from spends her days catching exactly this kind of crime. Some people learn that actions have consequences. My brother learned it in a conference room in Hackensack, in handcuffs, on what was supposed to be the best day of his life. And honestly, that's the only inheritance I ever really needed.